Okay, so this is my study guide resource for peer tutoring class. I'll be doing it on a topic on humanities, or within humanities, on the medieval ages and how they do crops and crop rotation and everything of the sort. And the reason why I'm doing this on video or through YouTube is because I lack all the motivation to do another boring project like PowerPoints or posters. So, because I do this often through vlogs, that I figured this will be a good touch of who I am to this project. So, quickly, let's go over what we'll be talking about. We'll be covering things like farming and sustainability, housing, and crop rotations. So first off is medieval farming. Much of it is very similar theoretically to modern day farming, things like sciences and how tools were first invented. And speaking of tools, I'm going to put up 4 images here, and I want you to tell me which one do you believe is the most important? Okay, now that we've gone through all the tools, I want to start looking at the fields because this is one of the most scientific and well thought, strategically planned thing that went on during the medieval ages, and this was the 3-field system. Now, for those of you who don't know the 3-field systems, there are indeed 3 fields. There is 1 for growing, 2 for growing, and 1 known as the fallow field. Now, the biggest and most important field out of these 3 is the fallow, and this is because the fallow field would actually sit without any crops, and it would be specifically designed to rejuvenate its soil, while the other 2 are being harvested or growing or throughout whatever season. Now, I'm going to throw up this picture here, and you tell me which one you believe is the fallow field. Moving on, beyond their farming fields and their farming techniques and their tools, the way that they actually really survived was based off of an ideology called sustainability. Now today we are more about economics, less of preservation, and more consumerism. And that's type of a society that you're seeing many environmental issues happen. Now the reason why that they didn't have this back then is because they ran off of sustainability. In layman's terms, they only used enough to survive now and allowed themselves to have a continuous, unlimited resource that kept future generations from surviving off the same substance. Now, with sustainability on the mind, manor houses were a big issue. Manors were actually the head official state, kind of like a parliament building within a village. And the king held all manors, but in order to gain a military, he had to divide the manors up proportionately. It may be him keeping 17% of all manors and giving the rest to higher dukes or earls, and then they themselves would have to supply a military by splitting it up and giving maybe 95% of the manors that they have and only keeping 5% to lesser lords. And then the lesser lords would then again have to give it and divide it to knights, who would then keep it and run it and manage it and have serfs of their own for each manor house. Now what would happen is that along a stream, which every village would be built off of because they survived and they strived off of water, is they would have 1 communal bakery, 1 communal mill, 1 blacksmith, and 1 tannery. And this made quite an upkeep of taxation, but taxes weren't paid like how they are nowadays with currency. Taxes back then were paid with things like food. For instance, if a serf had to use the bakery to create his own month's worth of bread, he would have to give maybe 1 or 2 loaves to the king or the lord himself in order to use that bakery. Because of this taxation, you see a lot in villages of this day, which was mid to late or early 17th century, is that a lot of the serfs, as well as the lord and the king himself, had orchard. This allowed them to have a continuous and limited supply of food, thus being vegetables. While we're on the topic of their houses, let's look at a picture of a peasant's house right here. Now a peasant's house is quite small. It's actually relatively maybe the size of a first floor or maybe the living room of an apartment. In fact, a barn nowadays would be considered luxurious during this time. To us, not too impressive. Now, they had a little hole cut in the roof, and this was an innovative thinking, is that this hole actually allowed the heat to escape the house from without allowing the house to burn, because their roofs were thatched. And by thatched, I mean they had hay raveled, tied, and laid down in rows to create some sort of a sheet to allow rain to not enter or seep through onto the people housing inside. Walls were made out of daub. Now, daub is a funny thing. Daub is actually a mix of pretty much anything you would find just laying around. Clay, brick, mud, pebbles, rock, manure. It was everything to create some sort of a muddy plaster-like material, solid enough that it could sustain the timber frame. Now, a whole family would live in one area. One area they would eat, sleep, cook, clean, everything, that one area of their house. But then again, you have to remember during these times, they really were not in the houses for very long because they had obligations such as crops or fetching water. Even kids such as the age of 2 or 3 were busy doing things like picking up missed oats off the grounds from people flailing, fetching buckets of water for the people who need it, bringing drinks. Now, what was considered luxurious during this time was actually to have another room above the animals, and some people actually slept there. This was considered the big bucks of the time, the Hollywood fame. If you had an attic above your farm stock, or your livestock, sorry, and thus being a 2-bedroom house. Now, a little less on the housing, and let's look at the village as an attire. Why was the stream the most vital thing? Well, the stream actually served as the lifeline for a whole entire village. A prime example, even though this is not in medieval Europe, is the Nile. The Nile River stretches throughout Africa, and its delta is within the Mediterranean, or entering the Mediterranean from Egypt. Now, a civilization known as the Egyptians strived off of the Nile River for centuries, decades, generations. And how they did this was out of careful planning and careful placement of items such as tanneries, blacksmiths, bakeries, mills. And to explain this better, I'm going to throw up a diagram right here. And the placement of everything was very critical, because if the tannery was in a spot maybe a little bit too close to the village, and the bakery and the mill were on the other side of the tannery, on the receding side, is that polluted water would stream right through the village and into the bakery, and therefore everyone would die of famine or disease or poisoning. And in some poorly planned villages, this is actually one of the leading ideas that caused the Black Plague, or otherwise known as the bubonic plague. Some of you may ask, what about the continentality of some places? What about places in the center and not around oceans? Well, they had what's called fresh water through lakes or really long rivers like the Mississippi or the Mackenzie. Now, these settlers strived off of different types of crops that you would necessarily see on areas such as the Atlantic, because the Atlantic has what's called salt water. And now salt water is a different, very different environment for things such as fish and crops because of the saline inside it. Now, the geography is very vital for things. I'm not saying geographical like topographic, how high elevation is or what sort of latitude they're on. I'm talking climate and weather systems. This is indeed the most important and vital tool that they used. This was known as the sickle. Sickles have a crescent shape that allowed the worker to cut through crops with no strain on tugging or pulling or ripping or ruining the crops. This allowed them to plow through fields much quicker than they previously did before. For instance, a place that's continentality, or otherwise known as landlocked, which would probably reside on the side of a lake bed or a really long stretching river, would have completely different crops than what you would see on, for say, the Atlantic coast. And being a geography student, I can bring this up to par on high-level details, is that those landlocked or in a continentality area would have what's known as a cool climate, severe winter. In other words, they would hit highs of maybe 30 or 40 degrees Celsius, but then in the winter times hit lows of 20 or 22 with what's known as convectional rainfall, which is large hailstorms, thunderclouds, and mass torrential downpours. You see this often in areas such as the prairies like Alberta, Saskatchewan. And because of this, climate weather, precipitation type, they have what's known as Chernism soil. Now, Chernism has the thickest and is the most fertile type of soil in the world. It has the largest amount of humus, and it's very ground up, thick, black or brown soil. As to if you try and farm in an area such as Brazil in the Amazon rainforest, because of their location, which is along the equator, they are at a very low pressure system, so therefore they get torrential downpour consistently. And therefore they are a tropical wet climate, high temperatures all year round and mass precipitation. Now because of them being equatorial climate, this allows for trees to grow really tall. But because of this, because of the mass amounts of vegetation in this area, humus is very thin, creating what's known as a lateritic soil. Now lateritic soil is very distinguishable by its red color. Because of its red color, a lot of the trees have to rely off of a leaching action. Now leaching action is much different than what you would find in a Chernism soil, which is capillary action. Leaching action stays along the surface and tries to suck up as much of the surface water as it can before it saturates deep into the ground. As to Chernism soil has what's known as capillary action, which is the opposite effect. It tries to allow the convectional rainfall to saturate the soil till it cannot take any more flooding, and then it starts to soak it up. And this really helps during its dry seasons in the summer. I really hope you've enjoyed this really long interactive YouTube video. I thank Ms. Menzies again for making such a wonderful course. I've really enjoyed peer tutoring, and this project has been something unique and innovative for me.